let's get into Module 16, and we're going to talk about stored procedures in this module. Basically, just in this module, we're going to look at executing stored procedures. So what we're going to look is querying data with the stored procedure. We're also going to talk about how to pass parameters to a stored procedure. And then we'll talk about creating some simple stored procedures. And I'll give you some good guidelines for when to use a view, when to use a stored procedure, and so on. And then I'm going to talk to you about dynamic SQL and why I don't like it and why I don't recommend that you use it. So let's go, first of all, talk about querying data with the stored procedure. So when you look at a stored procedure, first of all, you're not going to say select star from the stored procedure name. You're going to use the execute. So you can actually spell out the whole word execute if you want to, or you can just use EXEC. Most of the time you'll just use EXEC, okay? And then you specify the name of the stored procedure, and then if there are any parameters, you specify the parameters that are out there. So in this case, we've got a stored procedure, production.products by suppliers. Production's the schema, okay? So remember, that's the logical grouping. So for example, if you had, let's say you had 10 people in the production department, you could go in and give them execute permissions, say, on all of the stored procedures in that production schema. So it just makes your permissions a lot easier. You're not having to go to each individual stored procedure and give permissions, but you could do that too if you wanted. And then notice how they called this products by supplier. If this was me, I would call it USP products by supplier so that I can tell that it's a stored procedure and not a view or a table. But it's really, what I would say is when you get back to work, does anybody have a governance document back at work for how to work with SQL Server? Put this on your to-do list, okay? I saw 0 hands being raised. You want to have some kind of a governance document that specifies what your naming conventions are. In general, you know, how to approach SQL Server development. And by the way, you did not have to come up with this from scratch. There's a lot of examples online of people that have been nice enough to put their governance document out there. So if you just look for database governance documents, it'll have, you know, some good recommendations out there. So I would say come up with a naming convention. If you want to do SP without an underscore, if you want to do USP, anything like that's fine. But I just think it's nice to be able to look at it and tell that it's a stored procedure. Obviously, I can tell, too, by the way that I call it. But if I was just looking at the name of the stored procedure, I wouldn't necessarily know. And then when you call the stored procedure, when you call the parameters, see how they've got the at supplier ID equals 1? Obviously, that's a parameter, okay? You do not have to say at supplier ID equals. You can just say execute production.products by supplier space 1. You just have to put spaces after the name of the stored procedure and before the first parameter, and then you separate the parameters with commas, okay? So if you take a look at this second one, see how they've got production.products by suppliers, and then see how they're passing supplier ID and the number of rows, okay? Some parameters are optional, and you won't really know that until you look at the documentation for the stored procedure, okay? Notice that we're going to use the T-SQL 2012 database, and take a look at this particular stored procedure. Let's walk through the syntax. So we can see create procedure, production.products by suppliers. Now, when you get back to work, you may be the one that's actually creating the stored procedures, okay? And in general, let me tell you, there's some really good reasons why you want to use stored procedures. And the main one is, well, number one, it's easy to, once you write the stored procedure, it's easy to call it because you just say execute, and then you specify the name of the stored procedure. So it's real easy from like an end user standpoint to be able to call stored procedures. But the other thing that's really beneficial about stored procedures is this. Anytime you run a query, the first time you run that query, it's going to parse the query, which checks for syntax. Okay, so remember how I was showing you that you might be able to parse a query, but then it doesn't actually run because it's in the wrong database or something like that. Okay, all parsing does is just check for syntax. Then what it does is it resolves the query. So it figures out, are the columns and the tables that I'm referencing, are they actually in the database? So it makes sure that that's there. And then it goes and it optimizes the query. There's a thing inside SQL Server called the optimizer. And the optimizer figures out what's the fastest way to run this query. So remember yesterday we talked about like when we have the New York City phone book? Okay. If I say find everybody that lives on 42nd Street, it's going to have to do a table scan basically. It's going to have to scan through all the records. Okay. But if I'm looking for, you know, Sharon Smith in the phone book, I can go right to the Smiths. Now there might be a lot of Sharons in there, but I can pull back all the Sharon Smiths. So what happens, see, is when the compiler or when the optimizer runs, it figures out what's the fastest way to run that query. And then what it does is it takes that query plan and it caches it. So guess what happens the next time you run that stored procedure? See, it's able to use that cache plan. Okay, so the first time you run the stored procedure, you might see it take a little bit longer because it has to parse it, resolve it, optimize it, compile it, and then put it in the procedure cache. But then the second time, the third time, and the fourth time, it goes out there and it says, oh, I've already run that stored procedure. Let's go pull the plan out of the cache and let's run it, and it makes it for a lot faster execution. Okay. Now, the thing you have to remember is the stored procedure cache is only so big. So it's not like every single stored procedure plan is going to be in the cache. But if you have a stored procedure that you call 20 times a day, it's probably going to stay in the cache. If you have a stored procedure that you call today and then you don't call it again for 2 weeks, don't be surprised if it's not in the cache and it has to recreate the plan. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's actually true with every query that you run inside SQL Server. But if you think about it, the odds of 2 people writing the exact same query, pretty low, right? The odds of 2 people calling the same stored procedure, much higher. So if you can create those stored procedures, it just really will benefit you in the long run in terms of execution. So when we look at our procedure here, we've got the procedure is called production.product by supplier. And then notice the supplier ID is integer cout in parentheses there. That's an input parameter. Okay, so we're going to pass in the supplier ID, very similar to what we talked about with the function the other day when we were creating functions. Okay, and then see how after the adds, this is what's considered the body of the function. So we've got product ID, product name, category ID, unit price, and discontinued from production products, where the supplier ID equals the supplier ID that was passed in, right? Okay, so we're going to only look up the products for the supplier ID that we pass in, and then see how there's an order by product ID there. Okay, so this should be very familiar to everybody, right? It's basically just taking that select statement, putting a little where clause on there with a parameter, and sticking it inside a stored procedure. Okay, so we create that stored procedure, and then we can actually see the stored procedure if we go out to the T-SQL database. Let's go to programmability and go to stored procedures. And you can see there's the products by supplier. And then see if I want to run the stored procedure, I can run it like that, and I can see passing in the supplier ID of 1. We can see I get 3 records that are supplied by the supplier. Now notice I could also do it like I was saying without the @ symbol there. I can just pass it in. And by the way, I haven't really talked much about the semicolon. The semicolon is totally optional. You do not have to use that. We're going to talk more in the next module about goes and semicolons, but it's really just there to make sure that the compiler runs that code before going on to the next statement. So when I run this, see there? Okay. Now watch this. If I try to run the stored procedure without passing the parameter, see how I get an error message? Procedure or function products by supplier expects a parameter which was not supplied. Okay. So I get that. And then I could also, let's come down here, notice that I'm going to alter the procedure. Okay, now altering, remember yesterday we talked about DL, DML, and DCL statements? DDL, what does DDL stand for? Do you remember? Data definition language, right? That's my creates, my alters, and my drops. Okay, see how I can alter this stored procedure? So what I can do is I can go make changes to the stored procedure, but I don't lose my permission. See, if I drop the stored procedure and recreate it, what would happen to all the permissions? It'd go away, and I'd have to go and reset them. What a pain, okay? So in this case, if I alter the stored procedure, notice I'm actually adding a second parameter called numRows. We can notice the data type is a big int, and take a look at that number. That's just the highest number, basically, that a big int will hold. So you can put a default value in there. So we'll alter the stored procedure, and then when I call the stored procedure, here I'm going to pass in both of the parameters, the supplier ID and the number of rows. Or if I just pass it without the number of rows, that one actually still works because it has a default value that's in there. Okay, so if you have a certain default value that you think the user will probably use, you can put that in there. Basically, they're just not limiting how many rows will come back, but you give them an option. I'll also show you this. If you want to know what's inside a stored procedure. You can see how you can modify the stored procedure here. Okay. You could also actually execute the stored procedure from here. You just have to specify what the parameters are.